The boss, once untouchable at the helm of the Mersey Narcos, now found himself cornered in a war he could no longer control. Viper, his most trusted lieutenant, had betrayed him to the Mafia, sending shockwaves through the empire. Steel, his last loyal soldier, was running out of time and options as the White Tigers closed in on all sides. And Gio, the Mafia's puppet master, was playing a dangerous game, one that could crush the Narcos once and for all. In a city where loyalty is a commodity and every street is a battlefield, the question isn't just who will win, it's who will survive. In the heart of Liverpool, where the River Mersey meets the city's pulse, a shadow looms over the streets. The Mersey Narcos, a feared and elusive gang, have built an empire that stretches far beyond what most people know. For over a decade, they've controlled the flow of illicit drugs into the city, from heroin and cocaine to ecstasy and synthetic compounds. Their reach extends across the UK and even overseas. Operating from behind closed doors, their leader, known only as the boss, is a master manipulator, a figure of myth whose presence is more felt than seen. The boss doesn't speak often, but his decisions echo across the criminal world, shaping the fate of the city's streets. Their operation runs like a well-oiled machine. The Narcos don't just deal in drugs, they dominate the black market in every corner of Liverpool, controlling everything from weapons to human trafficking. Their network is vast, filled with loyal foot soldiers, corrupt officials, and key players in various industries, all of them feeding into the Narcos' multi-million-pound operation. Their grip on Liverpool is like a vice, so tight that the city's inhabitants can feel it in their bones. For many, the Narcos are a fact of life, a constant and intimidating presence that everyone knows to avoid. The streets of Liverpool, especially the notorious neighborhoods like Toxteth and Anfield, are a war zone. Rival gangs lurk in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness, any opportunity to take a piece of the Narcos' lucrative territory. But the Mersey Narcos have held their ground, intimidating their enemies with acts of brutal violence and swiftly crushing anyone who dares challenge their dominance. Those who try to infiltrate their network quickly learn the cost of betrayal. Disappearances are common, and gruesome reminders of disloyalty often show up in alleyways, or worse, dumped in the river. But the Narcos are not invincible. As the drug trade flourishes and their wealth grows, so does the number of eyes watching them. The UK Mafia, long entrenched in the world of organized crime, has begun to take an interest in Liverpool. Their tentacles, long spread across the country's criminal underworld, are creeping into the Narcos' territory. Unlike the street-level violence of the Mersey Narcos, the Mafia operates with cold precision, a shadowy force that uses power and influence to get what they want. The stage is set for a deadly clash, one that will throw the city into a deadly spiral of violence, betrayal and hidden alliances. What no one knows, however, is that this war is about to go beyond anything the Mersey Narcos could have ever prepared for. The first signs of trouble came quietly. At first, it was just whispers in the underworld, rumors of a new group making moves in the shadows. The Mersey Narcos didn't pay much attention. They had dealt with rival gangs before, and they always crushed them swiftly. But this time, the whispers were different. This group wasn't like the others. They didn't operate with the usual chaos or reckless violence. They were methodical, smart and calculating. Word spread quickly that the UK Mafia had started making inroads into Liverpool. For years the Mafia had kept a low profile in the city. They had connections in high places, from law enforcement to political circles, and they didn't need to cause a stir to keep their business going. But as the Mersey Narcos empire expanded, they began to see Liverpool as an increasingly valuable prize. They could feel the shifting tides, the growing instability in the city's drug market. The Narcos were expanding too fast, drawing attention they couldn't control. The Mafia saw an opportunity, and they weren't about to let it slip by. The first real clash happened in the outskirts of the city, where the Narcos had set up a stronghold for their drug distribution network. A series of brutal attacks on their supply lines began. The shipment of heroin disappeared without a trace, followed by a warehouse being torched to the ground. The Narcos were no strangers to sabotage, but this was different. The precision, the lack of immediate retaliation, the quiet manner in which it all unfolded. It pointed to something far more dangerous than the usual rival gang turf wars. It pointed to the Mafia. As the weeks passed, the attacks grew bolder. The Narcos, used to controlling every corner of the city, were suddenly being hit where it hurt the most: their finances. The damage wasn't just physical, it was strategic. Their reputation, carefully built over years of dominance, was beginning to erode. Trust within the organization started to waver. Who could be trusted? The Mafia was playing a long game, and every move seemed calculated, every blow a message meant to destabilize the Narcos' hold on Liverpool. But what unnerved them most was the feeling that the Mafia wasn't even in a rush. They were content to wait, watch, and strike when the time was right. As the war escalated, the streets of Liverpool grew more dangerous. Gunfights became common, and explosions were no longer shocking. The people, once shielded from the violence, now found themselves caught in the crossfire. The Mersey Narcos weren't just fighting for control, they were fighting for survival. But they had underestimated their new enemy. The UK Mafia wasn't playing by the same rules. The tension in Liverpool was palpable. The city, once a booming hub of culture and industry, had descended into chaos. The streets were ruled by violence, and the line between criminal and civilian was becoming increasingly blurred. The Mersey Narcos, always the dominant force, found themselves on the defensive, their every move countered with unnerving precision by the UK Mafia. What had begun as a series of small attacks quickly evolved into a full-blown war. But unlike the usual street-level skirmishes the Narcos had dealt with, this was something far more insidious. The Mafia knew the game. They played it with a cold, surgical efficiency. The Narcos began to notice a pattern in the way the Mafia was operating. Every move they made seemed to one step ahead. When the Narcos launched an ambush against a suspected Mafia stronghold, they found the place empty, not a trace of evidence left behind. When they raided a supposed Mafia warehouse, it had been abandoned long before they arrived, the contents mysteriously gone. It was as if the Mafia had anticipated every action, always staying several moves ahead. At first, it seemed like a game of luck, but the more the Narcos dug into their operations, the more unsettling the truth became. The Mafia was everywhere. They weren't just working on the streets. They had infiltrated the very core of the Narcos empire. Corrupt law enforcement, crooked businessmen, even some of the Narcos' own trusted lieutenants seemed to be playing both sides. The public began to feel the effects of this escalating war. Shootouts between rival factions became more frequent, with villains caught in the crossfire. News outlets reported on the rising crime rates, but most of the city remained oblivious to the true scale of what was happening. The police, overwhelmed and outgunned, could only watch as the violence spread like wildfire. Rumors began to swirl that the Mafia had their hands in the city's political sphere, making it almost impossible to touch them. As the Narcos struggled to maintain control, they started questioning everything. Who could they trust? Was the war being manipulated from within? Paranoia set in, with each member of the organization looking over their shoulder, wondering if the person next to them was secretly working for the Mafia. The trust that had once held the Narcos together now began to crumble, with alliances shifting and factions splintering. Loyalty was no longer a given, it was a commodity, something to be bought and sold. In an effort to regain control, the boss called for a meeting with his closest advisors. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing his grip on the empire he had built. The longer this war dragged on, the more apparent it became. The Mersey Narcos were not just fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for survival. The Mafia's plan was working. And as the city continued to burn, the real question remained: who was really pulling the strings? As the Mersey Narcos struggled to keep their empire from crumbling, the worst possible discovery was made. One of their most trusted lieutenants, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and unquestionable loyalty, had been feeding vital information to the UK Mafia for years. The shock hit like a freight train. This wasn't just a minor betrayal, this was the kind of treachery that could destroy the Narcos from the inside. The news spread like wildfire through their ranks, sending waves of disbelief and panic throughout the organization. The lieutenant, known as Viper, had been in the Narcos' inner circle for nearly a decade, handling some of their most sensitive operations. He was trusted implicitly by the boss and the other high-ranking members, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned until now. The discovery came when a series of encrypted messages, intercepted by a rival faction within the Narcos, pointed to Viper's involvement. At first, it seemed like a mistake, a coincidence, but further investigation uncovered a devastating truth. Viper had been passing on sensitive information about the Narcos' movements, their deals and even their plans for expansion, all to the Mafia. His position within the organization had granted him access to everything, and he had used that access to undermine them from the inside. He knew the schedules of shipments, the locations of safe houses, and even the weaknesses in the Narcos' chain of command. For years he had been the Mafia's eyes and ears within the Narcos empire. The news hit the boss hardest. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a direct assault on his authority and control. The trust he had built with his lieutenants, the relationships he had carefully cultivated, now seemed like nothing more than a facade. The realization that they had been living with a mole inside their ranks for so long made everything feel like a lie, and the damage was already done. Key shipments had been intercepted, surprise raids had been launched against their safe houses, and the Mafia had gotten too close to the heart of their operations. A manhunt for Viper was immediately ordered, but by the time the Narcos had pieced together the full scope of the betrayal, Viper had disappeared. His carefully orchestrated exit was flawless. No trace, no leads, just an empty space where a trusted lieutenant once stood. The boss, driven by a mixture of rage and frustration, ordered a brutal manhunt, promising death to anyone who had been involved. But Viper's disappearance wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem within the organization. The rot was spreading. The betrayal, once uncovered, sent ripples throughout the entire gang. Trust had been shattered, and alliances that once seemed unbreakable now felt fragile. In the world of the Narcos, the line between loyalty and betrayal was razor thin, and no one knew who might be the next to turn. As the walls closed in, the boss knew that the war with the Mafia was no longer just about territory. It was about survival, and the enemy was now with. The discovery of Viper's betrayal had shattered the very foundation of the Mersey Narcos. The empire that had once felt unshakable was now teetering on the edge of collapse. The boss, seething with anger, ordered a complete overhaul of the organization's security protocols. Every member was to be reassigned, re-vetted, and watched with suspicion. But the damage was done. Paranoia spread like wildfire through the ranks. Men who had fought side by side for years now eyed each other with distrust, wondering if the person next to them was secretly a double agent. Loyalty, once a given, had become a fragile commodity, and everyone was scrambling to secure their place in the new order. In the wake of the betrayal, a few of the Narcos' rival gangs, sensing weakness, began to sickle like vultures. The White Tigers, a ruthless group with a reputation for violence, had been quietly building their own empire in the shadows. They saw an opportunity to capitalize on the Narcos' instability, and their moves became increasingly bold. They began to make overtures to some of the Narcos' lower-ranking members, offering them protection and power in exchange for switching sides. The White Tigers weren't interested in just territory. They wanted to control the drug trade in Liverpool, and they knew that with the Narcos in disarray, now was the time to strike. In a desperate bid to regain control and prevent further fractures, the boss ordered a series of meetings with some of his most trusted lieutenants, those few who had proven themselves loyal in the face of betrayal. But the trust that had once held the Narcos together was now gone, and every conversation, every plan was fraught with suspicion. The boss, though a master tactician, began to realize that the situation was more delicate than he had anticipated. It was no longer enough to simply destroy the Mafia. He had to solidify his power base, or risk losing everything. Desperation led the Narcos to seek out alliances with rival factions they had once considered enemies. The tight-knit world of Liverpool's criminal underworld was suddenly a volatile marketplace of shifting allegiances. Deals were being struck, promises made, but no one truly trusted anyone. In the murky world of drugs and violence, everyone had their price, and those prices were higher than ever. The boss, ever the strategist, knew that these new alliances were fragile. A single betrayal could cause everything to come crashing, hitting the Narcos at their weakest moment. The blow was devastating, not just because of the loss of key players, but because of the humiliation. The Narcos had been outwitted by their enemies. For the first time, it felt like the Mafia had the upper hand. The public began to question whether the Narcos were truly as powerful as they had once believed. The tide of public opinion slowly shifted, with whispers that perhaps the Mafia had the muscle and intelligence to take control of Liverpool's underworld once and for all. But the Narcos were far from finished. The boss, seething with fury at the blows to his organization, called for an emergency meeting of his most trusted allies. What became clear was that their position had weakened, but not beyond repair. The Mafia had dealt a heavy blow, but they had also made a fatal mistake. By targeting key members of the Narcos, they had made it clear that they weren't just after power. They were after the Narcos' soul, their very identity. The boss realized that this wasn't a traditional war of gangs anymore. This was an ideological battle. The Mafia was playing a long game, slowly suffocating the Narcos' ability to operate freely. To counter this, the boss began making moves of his own. He couldn't rely on traditional methods of brute force that would play right into the Mafia's hands. Instead, he began to tighten his grip on the Narcos' remaining assets. The drug routes were adjusted, the safe houses fortified, and the remaining loyalists were reassigned with new duties. But more than that, he knew that the only way to survive now was to play the same game the Mafia had mastered: patience, subtlety, and manipulation. Yet, as the Narcos scrambled to adapt, the threat from the Mafia didn't slow. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that there were no easy victories. The Mafia, now emboldened by their recent success, began to move even more aggressively. They expanded their territory, established new alliances, and pushed forward with renewed vigor. The Narcos, already wounded, could only watch as their once unshakable empire seemed to crumble bit by bit. And as the battle raged on, a new player entered the fray. The White Tigers, a ruthless faction, with the firepower and brutality to take on both the Narcos and the Mafia. Liverpool's streets had become a powder keg, and with every passing day, it felt like it could explode at any moment. The stakes had never been higher, and the true scope of the war was only just beginning to unfold. The Mersey Narcos had always been known for their ability to adapt, but the pressure from all sides was beginning to push them to their limits. The Mafia's subtle yet devastating attacks had weakened their position, and now, the White Tigers, with their reputation for pure, unrelenting violence, were circling, looking for a chance to take a piece of the Narcos empire. In the war-torn streets of Liverpool, it was becoming increasingly clear that survival wasn't just a matter of strength, it was about who could outlast the others, who could keep their grip on power long enough to strike when the moment was right. The boss, who had once been the untouchable figurehead of the Narcos, was now battling on multiple fronts. The Mafia had infiltrated the political system, making it nearly impossible to act without risking exposure. Every time the Narcos tried to make a move, the Mafia was there, quietly pulling strings from behind the scenes. The police, once corrupt but controllable, now seemed to be operating in the interests of the Mafia, leaving the Narcos with fewer options than ever before. Worse, the growing influence of the White Tigers was making it clear that even if they could defeat the Mafia, a new threat was already at their doorstep. The boss's mood darkened with each passing day. The Narcos were fragmented, their once united front now riddled with distrust and betrayal. Even his closest advisors were starting to question his ability to lead them through this chaos. And yet, the boss refused to give up. If there was one thing that had kept the Narcos alive all these years, it was their ability to bounce back from the brink of destruction. The time had come for a shift in tactic. Instead of continuing to play into the Mafia's hands, he decided to do what the Narcos had always done best: fight fire with fire. They would turn the tables. They would go on the offensive. The plan was simple: isolate the Mafia and the White Tigers by undermining their most crucial alliances. The boss knew that both groups thrived on their ability to manipulate the power structure, to make their enemies fight among themselves. It was time for the Narcos to do the same. They started working in the shadows, quietly poisoning the relationships between the Mafia and some of their most important allies in the city's elite. A corrupt police chief here, a high-ranking politician there. The plan was to create enough chaos in the Mafia's camp that they would be forced to focus inward, leaving their hold on Liverpool vulnerable. But the White Tigers weren't going to be as easy to manipulate. They weren't interested in subtlety or politics. They were brute force, and they had no qualms about waging an all-out war. The boss knew that to deal with them, they would have to be met head-on. The Narcos began arming themselves more heavily, forming alliances with smaller, more violent factions in the city. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was their only option. Every day the stakes grew higher, and the realization set in. The only way out of this war was to emerge on top, with the city's drug trade firmly in their grasp. As the battles raged on, it became clear that Liverpool's underworld was a powder keg, and no one, not even the Narcos or the Mafia, could predict who would light the fuse. The city's reputation as a hub for drug-related violence was only growing, but at the heart of it all, the boss knew the truth. Only one group would come out on top, and they would have to fight to the very last man to make sure it was the Mersey Narcos. With the tension in Liverpool escalating, the boss knew that time was running out. The Mafia, though fractured, had an iron grip on the city's political and legal systems, and the White Tigers were growing bolder by the day. Every move the Narcos made was met with swift retaliation, but it wasn't just violence that threatened their survival anymore. It was the creeping feeling that the war had changed. No longer was it just a battle for turf, money or drugs. Now it was a battle for dominance of Liverpool itself, a struggle for the very future of the city's criminal underworld. The boss, ever the strategist, had always prided himself on being able to predict the next move of his enemies. But the Mafia's ability to stay hidden in plain sight had thrown off even his sharp mind. He had underestimated their deep-rooted connections within the system, with key members of the police, the judiciary and the media in their pockets. The Mafia was able to orchestrate public opinion and cover their tracks. The Narcos were increasingly isolated, unable to make a move without risking exposure. To make matters worse, the White Tigers weren't waiting for an opportunity, they were creating them. Their violent tactics were designed to draw the Narcos out into the open. Ambushes became more frequent, and gunfights broke out on the streets with terrifying regularity. In the face of the Tigers' brutal assault, the Narcos realized that they had no choice but to act or be crushed beneath the weight of their enemies. The boss ordered an all-out attack on a key White Tigers warehouse on the city's outskirts. The raid was meant to send a message, to remind the Tigers that the Narcos weren't afraid to fight. But it was a costly mistake. The warehouse was a trap. The Tigers had anticipated the attack, and the Narcos walked straight into it. A bloody firefight erupted, with both sides losing men in the carnage. It was a devastating blow to the Narcos, not just because of the lives lost, but because it exposed how vulnerable they had become. The trust among the ranks had been shattered, and now, more than ever, the boss feared that the organization was on the brink of collapse. The streets of Liverpool were no longer a battlefield between two factions. They were a war zone, with every group out for themselves. It was in the aftermath of the failed raid that a new idea began to take root in the boss's mind. If the Narcos could not outfight their enemies, perhaps they could outlast them. He began to entertain the idea of making a temporary truce with the Mafia, a dangerous gamble that could either give them time to regroup or end with them on the losing side of the war. But to even consider such a move, the boss had to navigate the treacherous web of loyalty and suspicion within his own ranks. The betrayal of Viper still loomed large, and the cracks in the organization's structure were wide enough that any sudden shift could break the whole thing apart. But as the boss weighed his options, a chilling realization dawned. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about control. And if the Narcos didn't act quickly, someone else, be it the Mafia or the White Tigers, would soon be pulling the strings in Liverpool. With everything on the line, the boss had one choice: adapt or perish. The city, it seemed, was in the hands of the few who could outwit and outlast everyone else. And the battle for Liverpool's future was far from over. The decision to even consider a truce with the Mafia was one that weighed heavily on the boss. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was everything, and the Narcos had built their empire on trust. The kind of trust that had been shattered by Viper's betrayal. But now, it seemed like there were no good options left. The pressure from the White Tigers was relentless, and the Mafia's quiet, all-encompassing reach had slowly suffocated every attempt the Narcos made to retaliate. The streets of Liverpool were becoming a war zone, and no one was safe. Every corner of the city had a target on it. Every deal a potential betrayal. The boss knew that if he didn't act decisively, the Narcos' reign would be over. The truce proposal was risky, but the boss had always been willing to make difficult choices. He sent his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Steele, to meet with the Mafia's top representative in the city. The plan was simple: negotiate a temporary ceasefire that would allow both factions to focus on their mutual enemy, the White Tigers. The boss knew that this would be no easy task. The Mafia wasn't known for negotiating with anyone, least of all the Mersey Narcos, and Steele would have to tread carefully. A misstep could spell disaster, not just for him but for the entire organization. The meeting took place in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. The air was thick with tension, as Steele faced off with the Mafia's negotiator, a man known as Gio, who had earned a reputation for being as calculating as he was cold-blooded. The talks were long, drawn-out, and tense, with each side trying to gain the upper hand. The Mafia wanted the Narcos to give up their most profitable drug routes, but the boss was unwilling to make that concession. In return, Steele offered something that neither side had anticipated: exclusive control of the White Tigers' territory once the war with them was over. It was a hard sell, but the Mafia, wary of the White Tigers' growing influence, agreed to the truce on one condition. The Narcos would have to stay out of Mafia-controlled territory during the ceasefire. Steele agreed, and the deal was struck. But even as Steele left the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He didn't trust Gio, and he certainly didn't.